We, the jury, sentence the defendant to death.
Wednesday, June 25, 2025. It was a day to write a unique name in the history of Mississippi, as the halls of Parchman's notorious Unit 29 fell silent. Inside the death chamber lay a man. He is not the regular death row inmate, and his story is dreadfully unique. That man was Richard Gerald Jordan, a Vietnam War veteran, an Air Force intelligence specialist. One time he was on air, shooting from jets, and somehow he had ended up becoming one of the longest-serving death row inmates in American history. But here's the part that stops you cold. This man, who was once at America's service, murdered an American he had never met. It was not in a moment of rage, not in self-defense, not even by accident. It was deliberate, and tragically, random. The year was 1976. A woman answered the door of her home in Gulfport, Mississippi. Behind that door stood Richard Jordan. She had no idea who he was, but he knew everything he needed to know about her. Within hours, she had been dead. Her family was left not just destroyed but confused and wondering. And Jordan? He vanished into the shadows of the piney woods. The question is, what was his motive? And why would a former military man with no history of violent crime turn to murder? Was it greed? Mental illness? Or something darker beneath the surface? Let's rewind to January 12, 1976. Jordan had been back from serving at Vietnam. Jordan was born in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. After graduating high school, he was charged with check forgery. And in exchange for his charges to drop, he agreed to join the U.S. Army, where he spent 5 years serving in the Vietnam War. Jordan was severely traumatized by his 3 terms of Army service in Vietnam, and did not receive the support needed to overcome this trauma. By the mid-1970s, Jordan was married with 3 children. He managed a fertilizer plant. By January 1976, Jordan became desperate for money, and he planned to kidnap someone from a wealthy family and demand ransom money. That day he made a payphone call to Gulf National Bank in Gulfport, and asked to speak to the person in charge of issuing commercial loan. The bank representative told him Charles Marter could help him. Jordan looked him up and learned his home address from a phone book, then set for his house. On getting there, he posed as a technician from the electric company needing to check the apartment's circuit breakers. He was dressed and carrying his work tools like a true technician. He gained access. In the house was Edwina, Charles's wife, and their 3-year-old son who was asleep. Charles was at work, and their other son who was 9 years old was at catechism class. Jordan abducted Edwina, leaving their young boy inside. Later in court he would claim he never meant to kill her, but shoot over her head when she tried to escape. Prosecutors argued otherwise. They presented evidence Edwina was kneeling, and shot at close range. Decades later, this case would drag through the courts like a slow-burning fire. 4 different trials, 3 overturned death sentences, and countless legal battles. In one of the hearings, something happened in the courtroom that would shake everyone watching. A moment of confrontation between Jordan's version of events and the victim's family's quiet, heartbreaking truth. And for a brief second, the courtroom stood still. This man must be a manipulative mastermind hiding behind a military past. Or was he a broken veteran, failed by the system that trained him? After he adopted Edwina, he drove her deep into DeSoto National Forest. There, without warning or hesitation, he forced her out of the vehicle and fired a shot from his .38 caliber pistol. 1 gunshot to the back of her head. Execution style. She died immediately. While Edwina Marter's body lay cold in the woods of DeSoto National Forest, her husband Charles still believed she was alive. And that's exactly what Richard Jordan wanted. He then called Charles, telling him he had Edwina alive and safe, for now. All he wanted, he said, was money. He demanded $50,000 in ransom. Cash. And above all, do not involve the police. Later that evening he called Charles again and set a location where he would drop the money. It was deep off the main roads, near an isolated wooded area outside town. The instructions were vague, intentionally confusing. Jordan wanted control. Charles arranged and carried the money to the said location, nervous but composed. Law enforcement followed him, quietly, hiding at a distance in the dark, hoping to blend into the tree line. But Jordan was watching. From somewhere nearby, he saw it all. He called Charles and said, "You tried to pull a fast one. I am watching you." And then he canceled. The next morning, Jordan called again. This time, he lowered the ransom to $25,000 and gave new instructions. Take the money, drive slowly. Take side roads only, no direct routes, and definitely, no tails. He did all that so that the police would not be able to keep up with him. He told Charles to meet near the Canal Road overpass on Interstate 10. It was 9 a.m. on January 14th. Charles arrived at the designated spot. This time, the FBI and sheriff's deputies stayed back, far enough to avoid detection. One agent and one deputy watched from an old pickup nearby, barely in sight. Suddenly, Jordan appeared. He moved quickly and grabbed the briefcase full of cash. They attempted to move in on him, but Jordan ran the sheriff's office vehicle into a ditch and kept driving even when shots were fired at his car. He abandoned the car and vanished into the trees. For hours, law enforcement searched the area. They found the car, abandoned. Jordan had bought and changed clothes. He had also ditched the weapon and tried to flag down a taxi as if he were just another man trying to get across town. At 1 p.m., while in the taxi trying to flee, a Gulfport police officer recognized him at a checkpoint, and he was arrested. They recovered most of the ransom. He confessed to the crime and took them to Edwina's body and the weapon. Few months after Edwina Marter was laid to rest, Mississippi prepared for one of the most disturbing trials it had ever seen. The man accused of her murder, Richard Gerald Jordan, had already confessed. There was no mystery, no search for the killer. But that didn't mean the trial would be simple. Because what came next was not just about what he did. It became a battle over who he really was. The trial is moved from Harrison County, where the murder occurred, to Jackson County because media coverage had made it impossible to find an impartial jury locally. It was held in Pascagoula, and jury selection began on July 19th. For 3 days, the courtroom heard from 24 prosecution witnesses. Richard Jordan didn't have a defense, and he also didn't say a word in his own defense, even when asked by the judge. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. And on July 21, 1976, they found him guilty of capital murder and sentenced him to death. However, something was already developing at the highest levels of the legal system. Just weeks later, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down automatic death sentences in 2 other states, ruling them unconstitutional. That ruling reached Mississippi, and suddenly, Jordan's death sentence was on shaky ground. In early 1977, Jordan was granted a second trial, again in Pascagoula. This time, the trial had 2 parts. One to determine guilt or innocence, and the second to decide punishment. On March 2, 1977, the jury once again found him guilty of murder. During the punishment phase, Jordan's defense finally spoke up. His attorney, Earl Denham, didn't sugarcoat anything. He told the jury, he was a good person until he was about 30. Something happened to him then, and I'll never know what it is. He was, and remains, a sick man. The defense brought in character witnesses, Jordan's parents, a prison chaplain, and others who had known him. But when the jury went to deliberate, there was tension. At least one juror didn't want to sentence him to death. The defense asked for a mistrial. The judge refused. And that evening, just before 7 p.m., the jury returned. Another death sentence. But once again, it didn't stick. In the early 1980s, Jordan's lawyers challenged that second death sentence, this time over the jury instructions. And somehow, the sentence was vacated. Another hearing was ordered. What could it be about this man that makes him escape punishment for a crime he already confessed to? Is it now really about him, or the legal system? For the first time since the trial began, Jordan spoke publicly about the murder. He told the court he acted out of desperation, buried in debt from a car, a boat, and department stores. The defense brought in family, friends, and even a death row guard to speak on his behalf. But the state wouldn't agree. They presented blood spatter evidence showing Edwina was motionless when shot, not running, as Jordan had claimed. They played the original taped confession, where Jordan said he planned the crime before even applying for a job. Another jury. Another verdict. Death. Again. 3 times sentenced to die. 3 times, it unraveled. This time, the issue was mitigating evidence. Jordan's legal team had tried to introduce testimony about his good behavior in prison. Specifically from a former attorney who said Jordan had even designed a wind-powered electricity system. But the court said that testimony was inadmissible hearsay. The appeal reached the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 1986, they sided with Jordan. The third death sentence was tossed. Can you believe it? By 1991, this case had dragged on for 15 solid years. It was time to do something different, so Mississippi's new district attorney offered a deal. He offered to give Jordan life without parole if he would stop appealing. Jordan agreed. But it didn't end there. At that time, the Mississippi law only allowed life without parole for repeat offenders, not for first-time capital defendants. Which means that the sentence was legally invalid. Jordan found out about this and challenged it. And you know what that means. He broke the deal. By now, the state was done playing games. The original prosecutor, Joe Sam Owen, returned as a special prosecutor. This time, there would be no plea bargain. Jordan's defense team brought 12 witnesses and they did all they could. But Owen disagreed. The jury took 35 minutes. They called the decision a no-brainer. And Jordan was sentenced to death, again, for the 4th time. 4 trials. 3 reversals. Only 1 man. On the evening of June 25, 2025, after nearly 50 years on death row, Richard Gerald Jordan took his final walk. At 79 years old, he was no longer the sharp Air Force veteran who was shooting from American jets. He was now the oldest man to be executed in Mississippi since 2005. And the longest-serving death row inmate in state history whose sentence was ever carried out. His execution had been signed on May 1st by the Mississippi Supreme Court, after the Mississippi Attorney General, Lynn Fitch, filed a motion to set an execution date within 28 days. The final chapter began 48 hours before the scheduled execution. As Mississippi procedure dictates, Richard Gerald Jordan was transferred from Unit 29, known as the death row, to Unit 17, a small holding area just steps from the lethal injection chamber. Towards noon, on the execution day, he spent time with those closest to him, his wife, his attorneys, and a spiritual advisor. They were allowed to stay with him until 4 p.m., the scheduled time when Jordan would be escorted to the execution chamber for his final meal and preparations. For his final meal he chose to eat chicken tenders, French fries, strawberry ice cream, and a root beer float. At 5:45 p.m., he was led into the execution chamber. The 79 years old was strapped to the gurney, slow and tight, while the witnesses sat and watched behind the glass. Before the lethal injection began, Richard Jordan was asked if he had any final word. He said, "First, I would like to thank everyone for a humane way of doing this. I want to apologize to the victim's family." Then he turned his attention to his attorneys, and to his wife, and said, "I love you. I will see you on the other side, all of you. The injection began. The sedative first, followed by the paralytic, then the final drug that stops the heart. The chamber fell completely silent. At 6:16 p.m., after 49 years on death row, Richard Gerald Jordan was pronounced dead. He stood before the justice system 4 times. And 4 times, it didn't break him. It bent. It paused. It waited. Until nearly half a century later, the system finally said, enough. But here's the question. How does a man who confessed, who never denied it, stand before 4 juries, in 4 courts, and 4 death sentences, without ever being carried out? Was it legal failure? Was it strategy? Or was it something far more uncomfortable? Drop your answer in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts. Thank you for staying with us on this one. Subscribe, like, and turn on the bell for more true crime cases that challenge how we see justice, time, and the truth that lives between them.